This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast, a bonus edition today.
Bonus book launch.
We are where faith intersects with the public square. And I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity, St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's Church. Where's the other fella?
And the other fella, Ian, is he's doing what we didn't do and get smart and going to school and learning stuff.
Educated.
That's right. So Ian's got class today.
Okay.
We didn't know he had class, but apparently he's got class.
He's got class. I've got no class.
Ian's not able to join us today, but we do have a very special guest joining us today that we are absolutely, again, this is the second time in a week, Kevin, we have been tickled. We have been tickled. We were tickled to have Kate Bowler with us a few weeks ago.
Indeed.
And now we are tickled to have Philip Yancey, who we're both big fans of. Philip's got a new book. It's coming out today, and it's called Where the Light Fell, a memoir. So Philip's going to, there it is. Philip's going to be talking about that with us and sharing some of the stories about his life and his journey. Also, of course, he's the author of wonderful books like What's So Amazing About Grace, The Jesus I Never Knew, and Where is God When It Hurts? And if you've never read Philip Yancey, just pick up any of those. Definitely get this one. But he is a wonderful writer, and there have been times when I've delved into his stuff, and his stuff's come to me at dark times that have really shone some light. Yeah. So I certainly recommend him to you. And anyway, Philip's going to be here in a minute.
He must be okay, because he's got like 17 million books out there, right?
Oh God, yeah.
So I don't think there's a Christian writer alive today who sells more books. He's probably the most well-received Christian writer who's alive.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I'm so looking forward to having Philip on here. It's a thrill for both of us.
Yeah.
We started this podcast a couple of years back, and then COVID drove us online. I could have never dreamed of, having people like him and Diana Butler Bass and Brian McLaren and John Pavlovitz, all these guys. Amazing, eh? Shane Claiborne.
We would never have been able to do it if it weren't for us going on this format. So we're thrilled.
Yeah. Books that you and I are sitting having beers talking about years ago, and now we get our authors on. Amazing.
Yeah, no, that's great. Great.
I should do a land acknowledgement because I'm getting all excited about this. I almost got past it. Last week, of course, was our first National Indigenous Day of Truth and Reconciliation.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder to us to continue to do the work. So we acknowledge that the land upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples on the lands connected with the London Township and Somber treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit, who we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land and with whom we wish to work towards reconciliation, hope, and a new future together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Also want to take a moment to thank our wonderful sponsors here at the Vickers Crossing. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And a big hello and thanks to Dave Mullen and the entire staff at A. Miller George today.
Yeah, and way to go, Dave. You're a good guy. Also to Carol Basada over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, and locally loved. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Move your prescriptions over there today. You'll get great, local, beautiful service from wonderful people.
And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Our thanks to Trisha Lister for being part of our podcast and for your gracious support as well. All right, it's time before we bring Philip in here. I think he's waiting in the waiting room, so we won't wait too long.
We don't want to wait too long here.
Nope. So what we do want to do though is jump into a quick little segment that we like to call, "Hey Kevin, who did we book this week?"
Oh, wow. Who the heck did we book this week? Who in the world? Well, funny you should ask. Drum roll, please.
Please.
No, please. Hey, Ian, could you put in a proper drum roll? And we're excited to say that this week I booked Michael Corrin. Shall I say the Reverend Michael Corrin, who is just recently ordained as a priest now in the Anglican Church of Canada. Has been a deacon now for the last year or so and was just priested about 8 or 10 days ago. His new book, The Rebel Christ, is coming out, and we have a book launch special with him. These book launches are really incredible. So we're looking forward to having Michael on. So we'll look forward. And he's a returning guest to the podcast. So we'll look forward to that.
Awesome. Good. Looking forward to seeing Michael again. Today is book launch day. A brand new book coming out from Philip Yancey, and it is called Where the Light Fell, and it's on Kevin's wall. It's in our hands. We got a little advanced copy so we could get ready to talk to Philip. So we will not make him wait any longer. Let's bring Philip in and talk about Where the Light Fell here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. And here he is. We're so happy to welcome Philip Yancey to the Vickers Crossing podcast today. We are absolutely thrilled that he is here. Here's the new book, Where the Light Fell. We're going to talk about this and hopefully some other things too. Philip, welcome to the Vickers Crossing. How are you?
Thank you very much to both of you.
Well, it's great to have you here. I know you're in Colorado, and
Yes.
Whereabouts and what happens in what's been happening in Colorado recently?
Denver is called the Mile High City because it's, as some of your older viewers may know, a mile is 5,280 feet.
Yeah.
And that's the exact elevation of Denver. I live in a little town called Evergreen, which is 2,000 feet higher. So we're about 7,200 feet. Wow. And we look down on the ozone cloud floating over Denver, or smoke cloud this year, and some of it came from BC. I'm sorry.
That's right. It's our smoke. Yes.
Yeah. But I had quite an exciting day yesterday. This is elk rutting season, and we've got the second largest elk herd, maybe 7,000 around, and they're supposed to stay in an elk preserve area, but they can't read the sign, so they just mainly go in our backyards and eat everything that we've planted.
Right.
And yesterday I was driving down the road and cars were stopped, and there was this huge 6x6 6-point by 6-point bull elk standing in the middle of the road.
Oof.
So 3 cars gingerly went around him, and when I tried, he charged me. Oof. And his antlers actually went all the way through the fender of my car and the hood of my car. So it's going to be a several $1,000 repair bill. And
yikes!
I have a red Subaru SUV, and maybe that's what ticked him off. But he was just standing there posing for these other cars, and then when mine showed up, whammo!
What's the name of that insurance company? We are farmers. Bump, bum, 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 bum.
Right.
Don't they always have this weird thing that happens to
that's right.
the cars?
That's right.
You
need to call them.
That is actually my insurance company. So maybe
Oh,
you'll see me
is
on a
it
TV ad
really?
someday.
Well,
That is the next commercial for
What's that
Okay.
actor J.K. Simmons plays the guy.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
You got it. You got
So
it.
I mean, you wouldn't believe this stuff unless you had somebody like Philip Yancey telling it.
No, that's
I've
great.
got
That's a
photos
great
to
story.
prove it.
All right. Well, enough of the bull elk. Let's get to the book. And
Okay.
Yeah.
and this is a special day for you. It's a book launch day today,
So
Philip.
excited.
I know. We're so excited to have you here at a special day like today. This is you put these together and you have to wait a while, then finally the day comes. So we're going to chat a little bit about that today.
Where I come from in Canada, Philip, is Newfoundland, and we don't have elk, we have moose. So they can do some damage too, but yes, I've never heard of that, by the way. That's incredible. Anyway, look, I want to start the podcast with a skill testing question for all of our listeners. Now, if you've not read the book yet because it's just out today, but this will be your chance to get a sense of something right ahead of time. How many bones has Philip Yancey broken? Okay. How many bones has Philip Yancey broken?
Let me check.
Because I got to tell you, Philip, I was astonished at how many bones you've broken.
I know. Yes, I had 6 broken arms in the same
you
year.
only have 2 arms, man.
I know. Well, I took turns, so only twice was it the same place, the same portion of the arm that was broken. But I would have twice during that period, I had both arms in a cast, which makes getting dressed and many other tasks of daily living difficult. So
it's incredible. It felt like every time I turned around, you were breaking another bone. I thought, wow. But look, I read this memoir, and we've read, Rob and I, many of your books. It's been something I've book studies in the parish. Mm-hmm. There was a parishioner in here just a moment ago, actually, and he knew I was doing this. He said, "Oh, I went to a talk that Philip did in Niagara Falls," and he said, "I still remember it." So, I feel like reading this, like I've read a bit of a prequel. I mean, I think that I've read some of these stories sort of couched in genteel language in different places in your books, but I feel like this is a pretty raw, honest, exposed, and vulnerable telling of your life. And your books largely, and you note this near the end of your books focus on grace and on suffering. Mm-hmm. You're incredibly honest, as I said in this book, about the pain in your own family, the loss of your dad at a very young age, and the difficulties with your mother, and the struggles that you and your brother have endured out of that relationship. Can you share with our listeners what motivated the memoir and why now?
One thing I chose to do, you deal with the life that you've been given. And my life, I consider a great gift, because I was put down in a dysfunctional family, in a dysfunctional church, at a chaotic time. I was growing up and emerging during the 1960s when everything was kind of up for grabs. Yeah. And one thing that has surprised me in the last few years is how much we're repeating some of the same cycles, patterns. You've got rioting in the streets, you got protests, you've got great divisions, issues of war, poverty, climate, all of that. I lived through that period and have wanted to do a memoir for a long time. One of the things I wanted to do was just capture the subculture. Mm-hmm. In the United States, there's a lot of fear in the church about we're losing, we're going to go the way of Europe and maybe the way of our neighbors to the north, Canada.
That's right, yeah.
Your churches used to be full, not so much now. No. And used to be in your public celebrations, there would often be a vicar on stage who would lead prayers, not so much now. Yeah. In the United States, we're going through those same changes, and a lot of Christians don't like it.
Yes.
And they act by either being very divisive or wanting to retrench and just pull back from the world. Well, I wanted to capture that moment in American history right before the change, when evangelicalism was on the rise. There were all these movements started after World War II, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of Christian organizations that are still around. Mm-hmm. And yet, gradually that subculture has become a subculture. It's not the dominant culture now. Right. And Christians are feeling kind of pushed out of the mainstream, certainly pushed out of mainstream politics, and they tend to side one way or another, and mostly side one way.
Yeah.
And yet I hadn't found, in my own reading, I hadn't found a work which captured what it was like from the inside out.
Yeah.
In the same way, I've read great books on Orthodox Judaism, for instance, by Chaim Potok, or great books on fundamentalist Mormonism, a recent book, Tara Westover's Educated.
Yes. Yeah.
And Angela's Ashes, Irish Catholic
Oh
experience.
my gosh. Yeah.
Frank McCourt. Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason I say my life was a gift was because I was given the extremes. When people tell me about leaving the church, they're so sick of the church and how terrible it is. I say, tell me your story. They tell me their story. And then I kind of sit back and smile and say, oh, it's a lot worse than that. Let me tell you my story.
Hold my beer.
And then they say, wait a minute, I thought you were a Christian writer. I say, well, yeah, I am. And why would I forfeit a connection with the creator of all things that exist just because of some crazy things my church did? And so you do read a lot of articles, a lot of books on people who lost their faith. And I did for a time. I suspended it. And yet I found that it was worth keeping. And the story of kind of living with the worst that the church has to offer and then experiencing some of the best that the church has to offer is the plot. It's what I wanted to capture, and it was made more intense really by my own family situation.
Right. Yeah. Well, you certainly did that. And in reading that, the book, it's you've done that. And as you say, there's lots of other parts to it of your life, and you share that very openly. And one of the ways you start the book is about the discovery of a secret about your father's death.
Right.
And you knew your dad died when you were a toddler. Obviously, I think you're about 1 year old or so. He had polio. But when you were recounting a visit with your grandparents and your then girlfriend, now wife, Janet, you write this: quite by accident, I discovered that this man whom I never knew, a saintly giant looming over me all these years, was a sort of a holy fool. He convinced himself that God would heal him, and then he gambled everything, his career and his wife, his 2 sons and his life, and he lost. Wondering if you can share what that secret was and just how that kind of came to frame you and your brother's relationship, even with your mother.
Well, I certainly knew stories of my father. He was always presented in kind of mythic terms. He died when he was only 23 years old. Wow. And he was planning, along with my mother, to be missionaries in Africa. They were training, they raised support. They had 5,000 people who were on their prayer list, mailing list, and were getting ready to go. And then he got polio. It was a severe case. He was completely paralyzed, could move his head just a little bit, but could not even breathe on his own. So he was put in an iron lung machine, these machines that would go in and out like bellows and force air into your lungs to keep him alive. He was in there for about 2 months, miserable existence. It was a charity hospital, the only place in Atlanta that had a machine like that. And he wanted out and believed that he would be healed. And the way I found that out was quite by accident. When I took my girlfriend at the time, Janet, to my grandparents' house. We were going through an old scrapbook, and a yellow newsprint fell out. And it was the story from the Atlanta Constitution, the daily newspaper, the story of this minister who believed that he would be healed, had all these people praying. And so he by choice was moved from the iron lung against medical advice. We moved. And for a few days, he seemed to be showing some signs of progress. But I looked at the date, and it was 9 days before he died. So of course it didn't work. And that was the gamble that didn't work out. And that failed experience, you know, I wrote one book long ago called Disappointment with God. Talk about disappointment with God. My mother was planning a career in service. And here suddenly she's left bereft of her husband, of money, with no preparation, no skills in managing life as a single mother. She didn't know what she could do. But I was never told that story. Later, I was told that she dedicated us, my brother and me, to God, much like Hannah dedicated Samuel to God in the Old Testament. And she took that very seriously. It started as a vow. It actually worked into a kind of curse, because nothing that my brother and I could do could possibly replace my father. So she doesn't really approve of my books or read them, my writing. And then my brother and she had no contact at all in 51 years. So that all played out in a way that came from that sad event, tragic event. And it's one of the things that started me on my writing career, just trying to figure out, okay, why do these things happen? Why wasn't he healed? Why are some people healed if they are? And what good does prayer work? And those kinds of issues have kept my attention for all these years in my writing career. And they really trace back to things that happened before I was even a conscious being. I was just a year old when that happened.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Hannah and Samuel, right? That story. I think you say in the book, it became your least favorite Bible story.
Right.
And so, and understandably so. I mean, I don't know if you want to say more about that sort of theological impasse, that reality of that vow and how heavy that can be.
I would broaden it a little bit and say, I have had to learn to separate people who claim to speak for God and people who actually do speak for God. The people who wanted my father to be healed, they weren't his enemies. They loved him. They wanted him to succeed. And so they concluded, but they took on a prerogative they had no right to do. They concluded that God would heal him and acted against medical advice on that basis. My mother also took on the prerogative of deciding what my brother and my life should look like.
Yeah.
And it didn't work out that way. And she couldn't face that. And the church I went to was a doctrinaire racist church. We heard racist doctrine right from the pulpit. And they claimed to speak for God, and they were wrong. I later found out they were completely wrong. And when the church does that, when the church either misrepresents God or even lies directly, which they did about some of the racial issues, then you start thinking, well, maybe they're lying about Jesus. Maybe they're lying about the Bible. And it mushroomed into a huge crisis of faith for me. And ever since, I've been going through in all of my books and trying to separate, okay, what is it that people are saying, and what's the kernel of truth here? What's the authentic and what's the fake? And that's what I've tried to do as a writer for myself, coming out of a background like that primarily.
Yeah.
When you look back on that time, and so it's Atlanta, it's the 1960s, right? And
right,
as you say, you grew up in that fundamentalist church, and racism is being preached from the pulpit. This is something that will be used in churches in the South, of course, to keep churches segregated. There were people like, I'm thinking of Robert Jones, who have written quite a bit about, 11 a.m. on Sunday morning being the most segregated hour in America because of this. What was that like, being in that church and having the church talked about, or having that racism when you're young like that, and what was that experience like?
Well, in those days, the laws we call Jim Crow laws here in America were laws. It was you could not go to a theater if you're a Black person and sit on the main floor with whites. You could sit in the balcony. You had to go through a back door. A Black physician could not treat a white patient. There were separate drinking fountains. There were separate restrooms. We just didn't cross all that much. And unfortunately, and not in every case, but in many cases, the church bought into that. In my church, for example, I reproduce a little card that the church gave out when civil rights protesters and activists started trying to integrate various churches. We printed up these cards and assigned them to deacons to give to any of the people of color who tried to enter the church. And they said, basically, you're not sincere worshipers, you're troublemakers, you're not part of God's family, we don't want you in here. And
wow, it's hard to get your head around.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And it's softened over the years, and some sincere students from an all-Black school, Carver Bible College, started coming to our church. And one of them applied for membership. He liked the Bible teaching, he wanted to join the church, and he was rejected. It was quite a tense vote by the deacon board, but it was unanimous. And that man is a man named Tony Evans, who now runs a 10,000 member church with a major program in Dallas, Texas, the Potter's House Ministry. I went to several churches like that. Every one of them, ironically, ended up selling their building to an African-American congregation.
Isn't that something?
They shrivel, they shrivel, they shrivel. They almost seem cursed. And then finally they just abandon it. And when the new congregation moves in, those old buildings rock once more.
I bet. Yeah. Listen, just picking up on that, like that theme. I mean, you write in this book about being racist and about being taught in school that most slaves lived contentedly in the plantation. Children of the Confederacy published a sort of catechism that asked what was the feeling of slaves towards their masters, and the good Southern kids would parrot back the answer: they were faithful and devoted and were always ready and willing to serve them. I mean, it's hard to sort of get your head around. You were taught the lost cause. I mean, that the Civil War was about states' rights and not about slavery. And the stories that you share in the book are startling for us to read. And I think a part of what struck me about it, reading it, is, I mean, I think in theory, I see this stuff on the news or I read it in magazines or in papers or whatever. But, you know, when I hear you, a writer I respect so much, recount this in your lifetime and what you yourself felt and parroted that you were taught, that was taught to you. It's remarkable to me that, you know, how much work we've yet to do, because we're not that far removed from it, right? And so you write, and I was interested in terms of people being able to hear that today, because what you write about is how something crumbled inside of you as you began to read alternate accounts, right, of the Civil War, and you realize that the spirit of racial hostility still lives on. You write about feeling engulfed by a sense of revulsion, not only at what you once believed to be true, but also about yourself. And I just read this short quote. You write, "Growing up, I swallowed the myth. Guilt denied never goes away. The South cast the war as it cast almost everything in religious language. On one of my childhood pilgrimages, I visited the Richmond grave of Jefferson Davis, which has this inscription carved in stone: Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And that is the myth, the lost cause that I believed as a boy and all through adolescence. Now, look, in this past year, we've seen all kinds of, a year and a half or so. I mean, I think that we had Nadia Bowles-Weber on here, and she was talking about how this COVID time has been apocalyptic, you know, sort of revelatory, that the veil has been pulled back for a lot of those of us who've lived with privilege and white supremacy and have been the benefactors of that. And, you know, with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, we've seen demonstrations, not just all across America, but all across the world. Here in this city, you know, we're a city of 400,000 people, and 15,000 hit the streets, you know, to demonstrate during the wake of all that. I think of Reverend William Barber as I was reading this stuff from you, actually, and thinking about how he talks about, because you said earlier about Jim Crow and all that. So the second Reconstruction, he writes about the third Reconstruction, right? That coming out of Jim Crow was the second Reconstruction, the first one being after the sort of Civil War era. Right. And now this third Reconstruction where he says there needs to be a fusion of religious and secular, black, brown, white, gay, straight. Everybody needs to sort of start pulling on this in order to get us to a place where some of these ills that have gone on for so long begin to be addressed. I'm wondering, what's your wisdom on how we help that fusion? Because I got to say, reading your account of your own life and your honesty, and near the end of the book, talking about how, you know, you've got people of color in your life who try to excuse you from what you thought. And you say, no, I was, you know, you weren't really a racist. You probably just thought you were. And he's like, no, I really was. And for me, I believe that's the place where we need to begin, right? Like, I think the beginning place with this is for us to all own our own sort of racial past in terms of how we participated. I don't know if you want to share something about that, but
sure.
I mean, it's quite remarkable.
And I don't know, did Canada have a history with slavery?
We did. Most Canadians have no idea. We like to look down our noses at the Americans.
Right.
And think that
we did.
We've got nice clean poops up here. But the truth is that we did have our own slavery. And what's more is the history of racial injustice in this country is really rooted in a more profound way with our indigenous
The
siblings.
First Nations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, that because there's almost a parallel in terms of the incarceration rates, the industrial jail complexes that were, you know, all of this stuff is parroted in a way. I mean, and of course, while we've got all this going on, instead of focusing on that, and we have this coming up on Thursday, it's our first national holiday for truth and reconciliation. This is a new a day each year for reconciliation work, and where Canadians are encouraged to stop what they're doing and focus on rebuilding those relationships. But while all this is going on, of course, we're fascinated by this big thing next to us, right? Going on in America. But I think that what's going on there is reflective of what's going on here as well. So I just think for you guys, I mean, it's obviously very pronounced and out there, but I think there's much for us to learn in this country about it as well. So I just know that your own honesty about it was really instructive for me. And I wonder what you might say about that.
Yeah, I would recommend a book called A Stone of Hope. It's actually a quote from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, A Stone of Hope, because it describes the mixed reception that that white denominations in the South gave to the civil rights movement and the protest of the 60s. They really kind of stood with segregation, but they felt guilty about it. So they never came out strongly in favor of segregation, with a few exceptions, whereas the politicians like George Wallace and Strom Thurmond and the governor of Ross Barnett, they were absolutely in favor of segregation. The church never felt comfortable with that. And one of the great gifts of the civil rights movement was that it was led by moral leaders. Most of them were clergymen, John Lewis and Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, Jesse Jackson. You know, they all come from a clergy background, and you may not like this particular set of beliefs or whatever, but they appealed to the moral arm of the universe, as Martin Luther King would say. And it worries me because we lack that now. And back to your comment from Bill Barber on the third Reconstruction period, Martin Luther King used to say, we can pass laws that prevent white people from lynching Black people. We can pass laws that force white people to serve diners and let them stay in their motels. But we can't pass a law requiring a white person to love a Black person. Right. And that's really what we're shooting for. We're shooting for the beloved community. We want not just to tear down the laws that separate people, we want to tear down the divisions that separate people, to realize that we are all children of God. And we don't have that kind of moral force today in the same way it was then. In this book, A Stone of Hope, there's a Martyrs Memorial. I've been to it in Atlanta by the same woman, Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. And in it, it's got etched in there the names of 40 people who died in the civil rights struggle, including the 3 who were buried in a dam in Mississippi and Martin Luther King himself. And he makes the point, here was this massive social change.
Right.
All these laws were enforced. And at the time, you could have predicted a new civil war in the United States, because in some of these southern states, the percentage of African Americans was 45% or so. I mean, it was kind of like South Africa. Everybody predicted a bloodbath there, but it didn't happen. And he makes the point that for a massive movement like that to have the impact it did, actually changing the laws, changing the culture, 40 deaths, which are indeed tragic, but 40 deaths is a pretty small price to pay.
Right.
And I think the reason is because we did have that moral leadership. And that's what I pray for today, that if we had a Martin Luther King appear on the scene and could frame it in moral terms, it would make such a difference. Right now, it's mostly people standing on opposite sides yelling at each other, protesting. Every time there's a protest, there's a counter protest, and they're just angrily yelling at each other. And if we had the leaders who could point to the umbrella, the moral umbrella over all of us, I think that would that's something that would changed the climate a lot.
Right.
It isn't the big challenge too, is that we're just dug right into whatever side of the aisle that we're throwing stones from. Like there's not a lot of movement. And but to have that type of Martin Luther King or whatever it may be to cast that vision somehow would just be so important.
Yeah, there are very few bridge builders, and you can see why. When you're building a bridge, you get walked on from both sides.
Yeah,
both
exactly.
directions.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you know the name Daryl Davis. Be fun to have on your program sometime.
Okay.
Daryl Davis is a large African American man. I mean, he's just a big guy. He could play in the NFL probably, but he's also a musician, and he used to do warm-up stuff for Jerry Lee Lewis and people like that. And he's an imposing character, and he goes into Ku Klux Klan rallies.
I do know this guy.
Yes,
you know the
I
story.
have seen
Yeah.
him. Yeah.
And he's gotten a lot of attention. In fact, Nicholas Kristof recently did a New York Times column about him. But he came out of InterVarsity. He speaks at these Veritas forums, and he calculates that he's kind of liberated 300 different people from white supremacy to join his side. Right. And he does it by just charging right in and treating them with dignity and respect, and proving that their stereotypes of what Black people are like are flat out wrong because they don't apply to him.
Right.
Exactly.
He befriends people, right? So it's that, again, we had a guest on last week's program, Joshua McNull, a young new theologian. His book is called Perhaps. And what he's lamenting in the book is that we either have certainty on one side or utter doubt on the other side. And this inability to sort of live into perhapsness of our creative imagination and our religious imagination. So, you know, he's calling on us to engage a way that moves from that healed, stugged in approach to actually ask questions that are perhaps, you know, that invite us to listen to one another in a different way. And I just think that, I mean, that's one of the hopes for me when I see the marches in the streets, like when they filled up, you know, Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, and, you know, after the former president had, you know, gassed and moved people from St. John's Church. To me, it's the young people who are preaching with their feet. And are getting into what Shane Claiborne calls holy mischief, you know, and John Lewis called good trouble, right? We who are aging in time need these young people to, and you're right. I mean, it will be something if there's a voice that can come into that void, because I think what Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others provided was a model of the way of nonviolence. So when you talk about 40 people, right, it's because their movement was a nonviolent movement. They took beatings, you know, and I think that what's needed now, because there's such heightened anger, and I worry about it exploding. You know, I pray to God that there's a voice that can speak to Jesus in the way of nonviolence and model that for our young people.
Yeah, there's a scene I recently read about, a true story of Martin Luther King. I think it was in Birmingham, could have been Montgomery, but the KKK had planned a major march with hundreds and hundreds of Klansmen all dressed in their robes. And of course, you know, because of history, that incites great fear in the Black community. And they didn't know what to do. And they thought there could be violence, and they just didn't know how to handle it. So the leaders of the movement in the city all got together and discussed it. And finally, they came up with a plan. So they were marching right past the church, which was the headquarters of the movement where Martin Luther King usually spoke. And they all lined up on the steps. And when the KKK people came, they all applauded them and cheered them. Wow. And the Ku Klux Klanmen didn't know what to do. They were hoping to be hated, you know, but instead they just kind of melted away. And all these photographers had come from, you know, news reporters from other states expecting some juicy story. And it was an embarrassment for the Ku Klux Klan because they exposed them. And it's that kind of creative nonviolence that really won the day in our country.
Big it's proactive, right? It's not being walked over. It's actually active, but it's
absolutely,
it's incredible.
I wanted to, Philip, ask you about a character that looms large in the book. You, of course, but your brother Marshall plays a
Right.
big role in your story, obviously. He's an important part of the book. So I wanted to just have you talk about him. Your brother is obviously an incredibly gifted and brilliant man, a genius with music, right? And his life does not work out like your own. Your paths are different. Each of you in your own way are kind of navigating life in the shadow of the relationship that you have with your mother. Marshall went to a conservative Christian college, but life got very complex for him. And then there was a terrible break that you talk about with your mother when he switches colleges, and there's a volatile exchange that shapes like 40 years or so of the relationship. So can you talk a bit more about Marshall with our listeners and the impact he had on your life?
Yes, my brother is 2 years older. Like most older brothers, he beat me in everything, certainly sports, and he could have in academics, but he just didn't do homework. And he would cram the night before a test and make good grades. But he just had incredible skills, very bright mind, and amazing musical skills. And he became for me almost a parable of freedom, because he was a child of the 60s. He grew up in a rigid, narrow fundamentalist background as I did, and then he went to a conservative Christian school, although my mother didn't view it as a conservative Christian school.
Liberal for her.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
With the Wheaton Conservatory of Music. But in a sense, he said, they can't make me graduate from this school. So he dropped out his last semester. He never finished. And he became one of Atlanta's original hippies. It was brand new back then. And he and his friends would hang out in a park in downtown Atlanta and drop out LSD tablets and, watch the world change around them. And then he went to California and basically did whatever he wanted. Mm-hmm. So in one sense, he seemed the freest of all people. But in another sense, he became enslaved to his addictions and many self-destructive choices that he made. And it's ironic, there's the reverse parallel in the epistles where Paul says, happily, I am a servant. I'm a servant. And in that very same book of Galatians, he says, it's for freedom's sake that Christ has set us free. So in one way, by serving, by learning your true purpose in life and orienting your life around what God wants us to, we experience a freedom that we didn't expect. We expect to be rule bound, but we're not. That's not the gospel. Jesus said, I came to set you free. And in another sense, my brother stood for the opposite course, where I can do anything I want. Nobody can tell me what to do. And I just heard today a quote from, I think it was Andy Crouch, you probably know that name, who said, idols start out promising everything and costing nothing. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, they cost everything and deliver nothing.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that was the story of my brother's life. He rejected the true God and still does, claims to be an atheist. Mm-hmm. And he found substitutes, and they all seemed so appealing at the time, but none of them measured up. Right. We have a good relationship to this day. He had a stroke about 10 years ago and is disabled. And in a sense, my wife and I are his guardians. We take care of his finances and where he lives and whatever comes up in his life. So it's a close relationship, but there is that rupture still in the family that has not been solved.
Right.
Yeah. So I wanted to sort of get a little of that out as well for our listeners to get a sense of just what, I see you and Marshall as survivors of, there's a church thing, because the church that you describe is not, to say it's conservative is an insult. It's it's more than conservative.
Yeah. Yeah. I joke about, it's just to the right of Bob Jones University. I don't know if that means anything to you Canadians, but
yeah, we know when about Bob Jones.
When you get beyond the right wing of Bob Jones, you're pretty close to falling off a cliff.
Yeah.
And we were.
It was it's sort of like the sort of stuff that would make Pat Robertson proud, I think. But but it's incredible. So you had to survive that. And again, as you said at the outset, that you've become, this writer, 17 million copies of your books out there, Christian writing, that you've come out of that is, to me, a miracle in itself. I sort of almost expect the Marshall experience, you know what I mean? But in some ways, as a pushback against that. But the other real part of this story, and I think that the sort of thread that runs right through it, is the pain that comes from the brokenness in your mother's life and the way that gets played out in relationship to you and to your brother. You refer to her at one point in the book as a common foe to you and Marshall, and that you had a hard time putting together the two people that you saw in her. So there was the Bible teacher who seemed to be teaching different Bible lessons every night and taking your 8-foot wide trailer to this church and parking it.
Yeah, parking it.
And it's like, what is going on? And so and
Can never get away.
And you got Philip jumping fences and going through yards to get on the bus to go to school, so they don't see that he's living in the trailer. And there's a whole lot going on there. So she's doing all this, and in the community, people will call her. She will pray over the phone and finish praying over the phone, and then turn to berating Marshall or right after that happens, so I think like you share stories in the memoir that paint a woman who is really terribly broken, and you do delve into her own upbringing as well, which gives some insight into that. But the stories of the cruelty to you, to Marshall, to your pets, to your the dog, the story of the
dogs,
dog, the dog story to me, and I don't know if you can share it, but it's heartbreaking. And so she and your brother have an incredible fallout after he tells her he's going to go to Wheaton, right? And they've been estranged ever since, as you've just said. There seems to be a little bit of thawing that you describe near the end of the book, but we wouldn't dare describe it as a reunion, but there seems to be some movement. Can you say more about your mother and about just how difficult that was and your relationship with her and how that's shaped you?
Sure. Actually, doing the writing of this memoir, which involved interviewing other people, exploring our past, and I came away with a lot of compassion for my mother. She had a more dysfunctional family than we had, I think, in a lot of ways. It was in poverty, 8 people crammed into this tiny little 1-room wide house in Philadelphia. And the brothers were kind of cruel. It wasn't a pleasant place. And the girls, when they grew up, had to get a job and then turn over all their earnings to the upkeep of the family. It was one of these Charles Dickens type stories, really.
Yeah.
And she broke away and found the love of her life, my father, who was a sailor who had just come back from sailing toward Asia during the World War II, and then it ended abruptly after the atomic bombs on Japan. So they got married as soon as he could get out of the Navy and get married, and everything looked bright. They were going to be missionaries. They agreed on where their calling was, to Africa, and they were in the prospect of going over there. And then this terrible tragedy hit. There was a bright light that maybe he could be healed, and then that was dashed. And here was this woman 800 miles away from where she grew up, now in this subculture of the South, which is brand new to her and seemed very strange, with 2 young boys. She'd never written a check. She didn't know how to drive. She had no source of income. And I think it was just more than she could bear. And in a sense, her offering of us, her 2 sons, to God became to me kind of a guilt offering, an atonement offering. That my life has crumbled around me. It's all my dreams are dashed. But maybe something good could come out of it if I just poured myself into my son. So she never considered the idea of remarrying, and she did. She did work hard. I I show how many she would have two or three different jobs going on at once, not only the Bible teaching, but also typing for teachers, driving a nursery school bus, and studying on her own to get a degree. So she worked very hard, but when she felt she was losing control and that we were just one more dream that she had that was being dashed, something snapped inside her, and suddenly we became the enemy. And I watched my brother. He took her on directly, and they would have these strong, sometimes almost violent clashes. A lot of shouting in that little 8-foot wide trailer. And I took the other attack of just turtling down, hiding behind a shell that nobody could get to me. And I know some of your viewers, some of your listeners know that feeling when they grow up in an abusive family. You do whatever it takes to survive. Right. And my brother and I had different survival techniques. He cracked under his, because it's hard for a teenager to take on a parent.
Sure.
And I just kind of delayed development there for a few years in high school years until I could get off on my own. Right. But the story is not over. Actually, after I finished the book, since that day, just a couple of months ago, I got them on a 3-way phone conversation. The first time they had heard each other's voice in 51 years.
Wow.
And it didn't go particularly well. She would say things like, do you remember when you came down to the dinner table when you were 6 years old and told everybody you had accepted Jesus as your personal savior? And
oh dear.
He shoots back, I'm an atheist. What did he say? He said he's an atheist, Mother. You're not really an atheist. I am too an atheist.
Wow.
You know, but again, that's the first time they'd heard each other's voice in 51 years. So the story is not over. And the hardest part of writing the book for me was the effect on people that I care about, that I love. And I have great admiration and respect for what my mother did right.
Yes.
There's some things I think she did wrong. And some of those things I think were theological wrong. She believed she did not sin for a long period of time. And that's different than my theology. She took on some prerogatives that I think are only God's to take on. And that was an encouragement to me as a writer, that what we believe about things matter. Yes. What we believe about pain matters. What we believe about grace matters. What we believe about the nature of God matters. And my whole pilgrimage as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, and also as a writer, is to figure out what matters most and what things from my background I should keep and what things I should discard. Right. And it's been a very healthy process. And again, that's why I see my circumstance as a gift. For my brother, it was not. It destroyed him in many ways. But for me, I was able to take them, and through God's grace, and I mean that very, very literally, through God's grace, turn them into something redemptive that has allowed me not only to keep my faith, but to lead others along the same path.
Rob, I sort of feel like going back to Josh McNall again, that book that we were talking about earlier, perhaps. I feel in a way, Philip, like you're the embodiment of perhaps. Like,
perhaps,
because you're in the middle of this volatile thing with your brother and your mother, and many more would crumble and just say, I don't want anything to do with that. I'm not gonna. And your brother's life, I mean, folks, read the book. The stuff that he's gone through and the ways that you and your wife Janet have been present to him are incredible. Many more would just say, oh, this is too complicated. People give up on relationships very quickly. Certainly your relationship with your mother is very complicated, but you keep engaging this, which I believe is such a faithful witness to what following in the way of Jesus looks like.
Because it creates that whole, you've created holy space for people to sit in, right? And
it's messy.
It's messy. And isn't
messy.
that exactly where Jesus sat, right in the middle of that holy space between, this world and this God's dream for God's world, which he called the kingdom, and said, look, folks, this is where let's sit in this space and look at perhaps, right?
That's a great title for a Canadian book, I think. Perhaps that's your spirit right there.
Exactly. We love it. Yeah.
But I heard a TED talk not that long ago where the speaker started by saying, raise your hand if there's somebody in your family, extended family, cousins and all that, who voted for someone that you cannot possibly understand.
Yeah.
And everybody raised their hand on both sides, you know.
Yep.
And then he said, okay, raise your hand if you still have some relationship with that person. And almost everybody raised their hand.
Yeah.
And I began to see that, I began to see the church as like that. You know, families they're all dysfunctional. They're crazy characters. You know, you don't have to go very far. An uncle, a cousin, maybe a second cousin, but rarely that far to find somebody who's just off the charts.
Just shake
And
the
yet-
tree, shake the tree.
Yeah,
The nuts
that's
fall
right.
out, man.
I know. I got visions in front of me right now.
Right, I bet you do.
Yeah.
And I started looking at church as something similar. And there are some people who I think are just wrong, and some people who are just eccentric, and some people who think I have a hard time being with that person. But I don't divorce it. I don't stop going to church. Just like I don't stop being part of my family. And for me, church is kind of it's a dysfunctional family. And that can help form us. It can help shape us. It gives us compassion. It gives us an outlet for service. You know, there are all sorts of advantages there. And there's a direct parallel to me between those kind of families and church. And I have to say, even the churches that I am pretty hard on in parts of the book,
Right.
as I later look back, I saw them as in search of meaning, in search of community. They want to find a place. They want to believe that what they do, the choices they make, matters. And the church gives them that. And then the church, as bad as it is, often is that place of community. So that when your house burns down, or when a tornado hits a town, or a wildfire, the church is there. It's there for its people. And no matter how bad the church is, looking back on the churches I grew up in, they provided that. They provided a community and a place of meaning.
For heaven's sakes, they let you park your trailer.
Yeah, that's right.
They did, rent free for the most part.
One of the places you talk about that you spent time in was, of course, Bible college, and it was quite a sheltered existence. Certainly, you chat about that in the book as well. I was laughing at you talking about this was a place that would go through the Valentine candy hearts.
Yeah, right.
You know, and if it once said cutie pie or hot lips, those were taken out. We didn't want
Censor those. Censor
those hearts.
It was a cancel culture.
Right, cancel culture of Valentine hearts. Yeah, big time. And while you're there, you're kind of going through this splitness where you're going through the motions, and you know how to give good testimony, right? But you don't necessarily feel it. And then that changes because you meet Janet, who we've mentioned earlier. And you have this quote from Augustine, who said, "Show me a man in love, and I'll show you a man on the way to God." And you meet her covered in dish soap and grime from washing dishes in the cafeteria, which is a great story. And you describe her as one of those students whose dissatisfaction with the Bible college kind of matches your own. So there's that connection there. And I just wanted to read this short quote from the book for our listeners. You write, "I lie in bed mulling over the evening that began with pain and ended with pleasure. I cannot get Janet out of my mind, nor do I want to. She has the quaint idea that emotions are meant to be expressed, not repressed. If she doesn't like something, she gets angry and lets everybody know it. Her joy is equally infectious. I wear my heart on my sleeve," she explains, "the first time I've heard that odd phrase." And you give her a special gift on her birthday. You talk about that. And in return, you're gifted with tears for the first time in years. Can you tell us about that gift and that moment? Because obviously it was very formative for you.
Yes. I play the piano, though I lived in the shadow of my brother. So I had never played for anybody since I think it was in the 6th grade. There was this roly-poly teacher named Mrs. Wiggins, who's quite a character. And I played something like Glow Little Glowworm for my recital. And meanwhile, my brother, went to a conservatory of music at absolute pitch, was just, you could pick up any instrument right away. But I was experiencing things in my life that I had never experienced before, and they were related to Janet. So I worked very hard and learned Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique, the Passionate Sonata. and played it for her. They had a 9-foot Steinway in this Bible college chapel, and we were breaking the rules just by being together, but she kind of hid behind a stack of hymn books or something. And I said, I have a gift for you, and played this. The title of the book we've been talking about is Where the Light Fell. And that comes from a quote by St. Augustine, who said, I couldn't look at the sun directly, but I looked on where the light fell. And that was my story too. I couldn't look at the sun directly. I'd been scorched by the sun because I emerged from that church with this angry bully God, just looking to break somebody. And part of my building the shell was building a shell against God, so he can't get through to me. And I was considered a heretic, a renegade. People were trying to cast demons out of me at this Bible college, and I took pride in that outsider stance. They're not going to get to me, and I expected God to crush me, break me. That's all I knew, that destructive God. But absolutely the opposite happened. God melted me, and the three things that I point to where the light fell are nature, which was always my go-to place to get away from the disorder of my own life. The beauties of nature, classical music, and romantic love. And those together convinced me that the church had misrepresented God to me. I rejected the God of my past, rightly so.
Yes.
Because I didn't know the real God. And when I experienced the goodness, and one could say the common grace of goodness, I realized that the universe is at heart a smiling place, not a frowning place. And the one responsible for it must have a smile, not a frown. We're told that God is love. It's not a verb, it's a noun. God is love, nothing but love. And to be love, you have to have objects to love. And hence he created the universe. He created us because God wanted something to love. And I started experiencing that love, not in the kind of religious ways that I had been taught, but in that common grace way. And I wanted to know that God, that creator.
It's a very profound moment in the book when you're playing that. I mean, well, first of all, of course, on the first date, you break a bone.
Of course.
Another bone.
This guy takes break a leg way too seriously.
Very good.
But that image of you playing for her and her sitting and listening and you weeping for the first time in 7 years melted me when I read that. I thought, this is incredible. Like, this is a beautiful image. So there's so much in this that we could continue to talk all day, but your time is more important and you've got stuff to do. However, I do want to, because I think one of the pivotal things for me in the book is what you actually say formally, you say is your conversion moment, right? So you write about being in this place where you couldn't, when you go home, you'd learn that there were protests and, braless women and all kinds of things happening in the streets that you had no idea that was happening. And it reminds me, when I read it, I sort of thought of the echo chamber that people are in today, right? Where the people just get sort of myopic about what's happening. They have no idea. And so in this college, you were so sheltered. And your way, as you've described it, was being a renegade. You sort of read magazines while chapel was going on. You sort of just thumb your nose at it, and at the rules, so to speak. And so you had this exercise you were given to do for the class, and it coincided around a time of going to a prayer group that you reluctantly went to and normally didn't pray at. And you had what I think would be accurately described as a conversion experience. And I wonder if you can share that, what that was like for you. And it revolved around the story of the Good Samaritan and a new understanding of that for you.
Right. Yes, this was a course, the class was on biblical interpretation or hermeneutics. And we were told to write a paper about a time when God spoke to us. Well, I had a long history of making up stuff. God spoke to me this, God spoke to me that. This is what this passage means to me. And I didn't want to do that anymore. And I had no idea what I was going to write about. So I went to this prayer meeting, and Joe would pray, and then Chris would pray, and then Craig would pray, and then they'd wait a good 10 seconds, and I never prayed.
Right.
So then we'd be dismissed. And they were my friends. They didn't ask me about it. But this particular time with the class assignment on my mind, I, for some reason, started praying. And I said, God, and you could cut the tension in the room with a knife because I had never prayed. And I said, I don't care about those 10,000 people at the university. I don't care if they all go to hell. And the tension got even stronger. In fact, I don't even care if I go to hell, which I say was like invoking witchcraft on a Bible college campus.
Right. Oh yeah.
And I kept praying. And as I prayed, I had, I don't know what you call it. I would say a revelation for sure, a vision. I had images, and the image I had was of the Good Samaritan parable that Jesus told, where the Samaritan person sees this person who's been robbed and wounded lying in the ditch and reaches down to help him. And this is not what Jesus had in mind when he told the parable. Clearly, he was answering the question, who is my neighbor? But when I looked at that Samaritan, I saw the face of Jesus instead of a Samaritan. And then I realized with a start, when I looked at the person in the ditch, it had my face. And every time Jesus, in the form of the Good Samaritan, would reach down to help me, I would spit in his face. And in a moment, suddenly everything twisted. And I realized that on that Bible college campus, I, the sophisticated, smarter than the professors, renegade, was actually the neediest one of all. This arrogant, sad character was me. And that although I didn't have a drug addiction and I wasn't being saved from sin, I needed to be saved from myself. And it was a stunning revelation to me. And I didn't know what to do with it. I just kind of stopped in the middle of the prayer and walked out of the room. But I wrote about it because it lasted for a few days. I thought, well, tomorrow I'll wake up and forget all about this. But no, it just, it changed everything. And I date my conversion. That was the hinge moment of my life. From that moment on, and everything changed. And I guess it was a time when I guess God knew I needed something authentic. I had so many fake experience. And these two things that happened, you mentioned the falling in love. I didn't even believe in love. I thought it was an invention of 13th century French troubadours, you know. But then I fell, literally fell in love. And now I fell into grace. You know, we got that strange phrase in English, falling from grace. No, you fall into grace. You know, the only way you receive grace is if you realize that you need it. It's a gift of God. You can't deserve it. You can't earn it.
Right.
And I guess that's what I experienced. So as I look back, it was so fitting that God would arrange a falling into grace. I don't take credit. I wasn't actively seeking God. I'd pretty much given up.
Right.
But I wouldn't be the first, you know, look, read the Bible. There are other people who are reluctant converts. And I identify so much with C.S. Lewis. There's a new movie about to come out called The Reluctant Convert about C.S. Lewis's life, because he said, I was dragged kicking and screaming into the kingdom. And that's how I felt as well. I didn't want to be one of those Christians. I had had enough of them. I had been surrounded and misused by them. But now suddenly I was. How do I come to terms with that? Right. Well, that's the rest of the story I've been writing about ever since.
Yeah, there's you use a quote of Lewis's because you then use that as your project, right? To share with the class.
Yes, I do.
I feel like you began that story with a quote of Lewis, who was sort of persona non grata because he smoked a pipe and drank beer, right? So
can't be a Christian, right?
He was a whiskey Palian like us.
Whiskey Palian.
Yeah. So what was that quote? I'm trying to remember it.
It was along the line about being dragged kicking and screaming.
That's what it was.
And I think he used that phrase, the most reluctant convert in all of Britain, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, Philip, we are so thankful that you gave us the time today on this very special day for you. It's the book launch, and for our YouTube watchers, we've got the book there. For those that are listening, go to our website, thevicarscrossing.com. You will find a link to the book as well, so you can order it. And it's a wonderful memoir and a wonderful story. And you certainly have shone a lot of light on us today. And we know that light will be shone on many people who pick this up and read it and sharing your story. So thank you, Philip, for spending time with us today.
Well, it's a delight, and thank you for actually reading the book before we talk. Not everybody does that.
It was a wonderful book. Yeah,
it's incredible, and I this is a red letter day to meet you. I got to say that I just the thought when Rob and I started this silly thing a few years ago, if we had said, well, you know what we'll do, we'll get Philip Yancey on, and right, we would have said, we're sitting at a pub drinking beer, dreaming this thing up because we're whiskey aliens, and it's like I would have never dreamed. It's incredible to talk to you. I just am so honored. So thank you for making time.
Good, thank you.
Well, I love coming to your country. In fact, I had a good tour there canceled. I did one tour out in Vancouver, the last thing before the shutdown. For used to be the Canadian Leprosy Mission. Now it's called Effect Hope, and there was no one scheduled for Toronto that got canceled. So maybe maybe once will you let us back into your country? Maybe we can come again.
Actually, you folks are allowed in.
Oh, I see. But I can't.
We're not allowed. Right? We're not allowed to go there.
We're not allowed to go to America because
Joe doesn't want us over there yet.
Now that's interesting that we keep people from immigrating from the north, but they can't stop them from the south. So
exactly. They don't want
figure
us
that.
Thank you again.
Wow, that was a treat. That was amazing. Like we said off the top of the show when we started doing this, there was at no point we looked at each other and said, I'm sure Philip Yancey might be able to come on the podcast. It's like, nah.
No, I mean, he must have been really honored to be talking to us today.
Oh, of course he was. Yeah, of course he was. But no, it's been wonderful to have him and to meet him and really loved the book too. It's a wonderful memoir. Certainly encourage everybody to find that on our website and make sure you pick it up and enjoy that. All right. It's good. Thanks, Kevin. Good to see you again. Ian, we miss you wherever you are, but we will see you again on our next podcast coming up in a bit. And I want to thank our sponsors today, of course, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And that does it for us. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Church in London.
Kevin George from St. Aidan's.
And until we meet again, Kevin, remember, my friend, to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Might be a big bull elk there.
It could be. The elk. That's rough.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!